What's going on, folks? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast, a podcast where we explore all areas of trail and ultra running, including training, hydration, physiology, psychology, as well as have a little bit of fun banter along the way. On this episode of the podcast, we have Andy Blow coming to us all the way from the United Kingdom. Andy is the founder of Precision Hydration, and they offer sweat sodium testing and customized hydration solutions for all different types of athletes. I initially came to know Andy as he was one of the presenters at the 2019 Training Peaks Endurance Coaching Summit. And what struck me about that presentation there is this very practical and pragmatic solution that they are bringing to customized hydration, which at times can be a complicated and somewhat nuanced science to study. And whenever I find practitioners, other coaches, and scientists in the field that can blend those simple solutions to complex problems, I've always become quite appreciative of that, and I think that Andy and his team over at Precision Hydration does a great job with it. We cover a lot of areas in this podcast, including how his company came to be based off of a personal experience that Andy had. What athletes are good candidates to get sweat sodium testing, how you can find out if you're a good candidate for this, and what's the science behind it? We hear a lot of conflicting advice in terms of sodium and hydration, and we try to cut through the clutter in that particular regard. I found this conversation really fun, and as I mentioned earlier, what the folks do over at Precision Hydration, I've come to appreciate more and more as I've looked at what they do. In an effort of full disclosure, there's no financial entanglement between myself or this podcast and the folks over at Precision Hydration. I don't receive a dime for bringing them on the podcast. They have set up a coupon code for the listeners if you are so inclined to go and check them out. That promo code is KoopCast, all in caps, and you can go over to precisionhydration.com to take advantage of that. It is worth 15% off of your first order. But I had a lot of fun with this conversation, and let's get right into it. Here it is with Andy Blow talking about all things hydration and sodium. I was thinking about this morning on my run and I actually took a spill. You can see that on my hand. I actually owe you an apology to start out with. Yeah, because last year we were both at the Training Peaks conference.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at the lineup, and I was one of the roundtable presenters. So the way that you remember the way the conference works, but just to kind of set it up for the listeners, is there's, maybe 6 or 8 kind of what I would call main speakers that use a big conference room, and then they had a group of maybe 10 roundtable speakers, and all of these things were going on concurrently. So it's really hard for the presenters to see some of the presentations and also give their stuff because of all the things going on. I think you presented 2 or 3 times, right? Right?
Twice, I think. Yeah, twice. One on each day, I reckon. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I did the same 30-minute presentation 9 times.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
It's a tough gig.
Well, I mean, presentation is probably overstating its value. It was really more leading a discussion than anything else. But my point with that is I remember looking at the lineup, and I had to be really choosy with what presenters I actually went to because I didn't have the time availability to go see everything. And immediately I knew who you were, obviously. It's like, this freaking bloke Andy is gonna just push customized hydration solutions on people in this over commercialized fashion, and I don't want to go see this, and I don't know whether I was in a bad mood that day or whatever. But then I watched all the presentations afterwards because they were banked, and I'm like, shit, that was really reasonable. I wish I would have actually seen that live, because it was not the stereotypical, here's my product and here's why it applies to everybody, which is what we see a lot, especially in the nutrition space. It was really reasonable. It was very well thought out. So unbeknownst to you, I've owed you this apology for like a year now.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. I think one of your colleagues, is it, I'm trying to remember his name.
It was Adam. Yeah.
Adam St. Pierre. Adam definitely came and sat in the front row looking for a fight when we did that presentation. And he actually grudgingly came up to me afterwards and like had a reasonable conversation. So I was quite pleased about that.
We're gonna talk about that a little bit, but he did his master's thesis on hydration, and so I think that was a little bit of his bias going in. And he did, so to explain that story a little bit to listeners, one of our coaches, Adam St. Pierre, who's been on the podcast before, he's great. He's a great coach. He attended Andy's talk, and Andy describes was looking for a fight on some of the information that was presented, and after the presentation was over, he set it up so he could get 2 sweat sodium tests done.
Correct, yeah.
The second one of which he was trying to manipulate by consuming copious amounts of sodium in between the two as this like proof point to say, we'll see diet can manipulate this. And it turns out he was wrong. And we'll probably discuss why he was wrong when we get into the technical parts of this. But he was quite frustrated afterwards because he was wrong. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, no, it was good. It was actually, I've referenced that little incident with a few people because it was interesting chatting with him. And, you know, I've had that because we're a commercial company, you know, we've got a kind of a dog in the fight there. So it does, people's initial impression is sometimes, okay, well, these people want to sell products, and yeah, we do want to sell products, but the difference is I think we want to sell products for the right purpose to the right people to help them do what they want to do. We're not interested in, you know, selling it in gas stations and that kind of thing, which has been the industry model.
Yep. You settle 7-Eleven eventually.
Yeah.
I mean, that's you're right. That is the model. Okay. So before we get too far into the weeds of sweat sodium testing, to kind of like set this up, I want to discuss like your athletic background first.
Yeah.
Because this is a story that we see play out in the endurance space a lot, where we have athletes that are going through their careers at whatever stage they are, competitive collegiately, some of them are, you know, professional to a certain extent, and they encounter some problem throughout the course of their athletic endeavors, and they decide to solve that, take it on their own accord, solve it, and then they turn it into a business. And that's very much like your story. So why don't we go through that first, and then we'll start talking about how, like where it is current day.
Yeah, 100%. You're right. I suffered with hydration related problems as an athlete. So I started out I did soccer as a teenager, as a young lad, and as a teenager, like most kids in the UK do, but never really progressed particularly far with that. Got into endurance sports. I'd always swum a little bit. I'd done some running, cross-country running, and my dad took me along to do swim run and a bit of biathlon. Saw the triathlon bikes there, and I got into triathlon when it was still relatively young. I think I did my first triathlon in around about 1996. So it wasn't a brand new sport by any means, but it was really, you know, it was niche. It was speedos, getting changed in the car park, you know, and it was all happening at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, that kind of thing. And I pursued that reasonably seriously as a teenager, and then really seriously when I got to university, because I went to university to study sport and exercise science, and I chose the University of Bath in the UK because it was a triathlon centre of excellence. And I had a goal, which was a bit of a pipe dream, but I wanted to go to the Olympic Games, you know, like a lot of young athletes do. I wasn't going to make the team for Sydney, but if I had any chance, it would be for 2004 for the Athens Games. So I started on this journey in the late 90s to try and sort of look ahead to that. But my talent I was not a bad athlete, but my talent wasn't there. I was good enough to make the squads and things, but not the real teams. And so at that point, I sort of transitioned from short course triathlon into Ironman and Xterra racing, because that was a logical next step. And it was at that point particularly that I noticed that I went to, my first Ironman was in the year 2000. I went to Switzerland, and it was a really hot year, as it often is there actually, funnily enough. And I was in great shape, but I did 10.5 hours for the Ironman, which isn't, it's not a horrific time, but I was punching for 9 hours or something like that. And it was because I walked a lot of the marathon. I was peeing all the time. I'd got my hydration completely wrong. And this then became a repeating process over and over. I'd get cramps. I'd fall apart in long races. Went down with hyponatremia a couple of times. And it was ultimately that frustration that led me into like then delving into sweat, sodium, all that kind of stuff, and figuring it out for me initially.
And at that time, were you using like the widely available commercial sports products, like the Gatorade that was on the course and the power bars and the gold wrappers? You remember those?
Yeah,
power bars and the gold wrappers and things like that.
I used to take those, cut them up, stick them to the top tube of my bike, and then spend a week jet washing it afterwards to get
those are so
off.
gross, man. They were so gross.
It was the options. It was the options we had. But yeah, I would just, and back then for me, hydration was the mantra at the time. You've talked about this with previous guests on your podcast. In the 90s, the mantra was, more is better when it comes to fluid. So ultimately, as a sports science student at that time, if I was having a problem in a race, I was probably in my head not drinking enough. So I'm then drinking more. I'm drinking, dilute sports drinks or water, piling more and more fluid in. I was aware that it's obvious anyone who's trained near to me understands I have a very high sweat rate. This is just a visible fact. I will be soaked as soon as I start exercising. But so I'm thinking more fluid, and I'm thinking I've been taking electrolytes, because at that point electrolytes for me were like a magical little element. You just needed a little tinkle of that in your drink, and that took care of it. There's genuinely no insight as to what the level of electrolytes were or anything, or even what the electrolytes were. It was just like this term. So I thought I'm taking electrolytes, and it was then actually kind of going back to the drawing board. It was a friend of mine who was a doctor who I'd complained vigorously about my problems to, and this friend of mine said, "Well, I've seen photos of you at the races. You're covered in salt, you sweat a lot. This could be everything you're describing is like what I see in hospital patients when we've got massive electrolyte imbalance. So let's get your sweat tested." So I was like, "Why the hell would you do that?" Okay, and then we start this thing and I start Googling then, even though I'm on a dial-up modem, trying to find stuff online. And I actually found most of the useful information online back in the early 2000s was in ultrarunning forums, on the early ultrarunning forums on the web.
Yeah, the ultra listserv.
Yeah, I'd find these guys, and I'd read every thread in every rabbit hole that had the word sodium or sweat in it, and I start to piece together that there's these people, and there's some people that I'm reading about that are taking phenomenal amounts of salt in races, especially in the US in the heat and that kind of thing. And I'm like, I talk to my friend, the Dr. Jutley, he gets me sweat tested. We find out that I'm losing like a high amount of sweat, and I'm also losing a very high concentration of sodium in my sweat. So like, to give that some context, probably close to 2,000 milligrams in every litre that I sweat out, which is about, in other terminology, about 85, 90 millimole of sodium. And he says to me, right, well, a lot of people lose way less than that. So you are basically excreting loads of fluid, loads of salt, and then you're just diluting and depleting your body. 2,000
milligrams per litre is, I'm going to use a really technical term here, it's a shit ton of sodium in your sweat. And to contextualize that for the audience that hasn't listened to a few of the other podcasts, we're going to get into the ranges a little bit, but many of the good commercially available fluid replacement products out there, so Cliff Bar has one, Osmo has one, Scratch Labs has one. They all kind of fall into the like 450 milligrams per liter to like maybe 600 milligrams per liter of fluid. You're 4 times above that.
Yeah.
Just based on the sweat sodium testing. And I think that's now. When you were actually getting that test in the early 2000s, the sodium concentrations of the commercially available products were 200 or 150 milligrams per liter.
Yeah. I was underdoing my sodium intake by probably about a factor of 10, roughly. When I worked it out over the over the duration of the event. And gradually, with a bit of reading on these forums, with some confidence instilled in me, but that the fact that my, you know, Dr. Jutley's a medic, the guy's a heart surgeon, so he knows his stuff. You know, he's saying to me, we should try taking this amount. And I'm like, well, do you see how much that is? And he's like, yep, let's try it. Let's try it. And so, you know, we're like turning up the volume on this, turning up the volume, and eventually, you know, trial and error, you get there. But it took me, even at that point, probably took me 4 or 5 years. And, you know, long story short for me on that, it ended up that in the heat, I was like 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour guy on the bike in an Ironman. And then I could get off and run a strong marathon, you know, and it was night and day for me. The difference was unbelievable.
When you initially got sweat sodium tested, and just to time frame this, he says mid 2000s, right?
Yeah, it's like early, probably. I wish I knew exactly. I guess I would have been tested around 2004. I did Kona in 2004 and had a horrendous experience. And so it would have been soon after that where I really kind of was like, if I'm going to do this again, I'm going to do this right.
Were they using the absorbent patches at that point?
You could get that done, but we just went to a hospital and got a cystic fibrosis sweat test.
Okay. So the same one that you guys do.
Technology that we use now. Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna get into that a little bit, because there's different types of tests that people can go out and get. I didn't know that was, I mean, it's obviously available at the time, but it was just so specialized. Not a lot of people had access to it. So kudos to you for thinking outside the box on how to get that done.
Yeah, that was a combination of a bit of good fortune, some good advice, and then what actually then happened, part of the story of how precision hydration came about, is that we bought cystic fibrosis testing units to use with athletes. And of course, the company that builds those is going, who are these like weird people in the UK who are buying our technology and doing loads of testing who are clearly not cystic fibrosis doctors? So they were fantastically supportive in encouraging us to say, well, if the athletic and human performance market needs to understand sweat sodium, then we have the technology. Will you help us take the technology to that market? So that sowed the seed for, you know, putting the business together.
I'm fascinated by this because, once again, this is a story we kind of see play out every once in a while in endurance sports, where somebody has a personal experience and they turn it into a business or a product or something like that. I mean, entrepreneurs have been doing that for, you know, decades and decades. But in your case, you have this personal experience, and you combine that with the fact that your personal experience is anomalous. Fair statement?
I would say not. Now that we've got a lot more data, there's probably 15 to 20% of the people that we test have high or very, what we would classify as high or very high sweat sodium losses. So although I'm at a relatively high end of the range, we test people every single week now who are in that range. Now, our data set may be a little skewed in the fact that people come to us because they may be perceived they're having problems or whatever. But we've sweat tested now over 10,000 people.
Wow, that's a big
So
test.
we got some big data, and we're actually crunching the numbers to look at publishing some of that at the moment. But the range is basically, we've seen people down at 200 and some milligrams of sodium per litre, and we've seen people up at nearly 3,000 milligrams per litre. So my crown as the kind of saltiest sweat guy was taken quite a few years ago. I'm in the mix. I'm at the higher end, but I'm not on the podium.
Okay, but it's still at the edge of the bell curve. And I'm really glad that you contextualized the data set that you have at Precision Hydration with, you might be getting people that are just having issues. Because when you look at it in the literature, if you look at the bell curve of people's sweat sodium concentrations, it's probably shifted a little bit to the left, where like the bulk of that bell curve is 400, 500, 600 milligrams per liter or something like that. Your bell curve might be shifted a little bit to the right, if I'm imagining it correctly.
I would say, actually, looking at the big data set, so not independent of ours. So Gatorade have published some big data sets, and there's been control studies for cystic fibrosis tests, because they take healthy population as well. The average sweat sodium level is nearly always around 950 milligrams per litre. That's the middle of the curve. I would say that people below, a long way below 600 is relatively getting more unusual. You know, like 600 is definitely lower side. and above 1200, 1300 is higher side. You've got a really big group in that, just either side of 900, basically. Okay. The vast majority of a lot of data sits within there.
Okay. So let's get back to the dialogue that we're going through in terms of translating this to a widely available product. So you've got your test case, which is I categorize as anomalous, but you're still at the edge of the bell curve, or towards the edge of the bell curve. And then you couple it with this technology that is not meant for athletes. Yeah. Right? It's meant for cystic fibrosis patients. How do you then take these two things, your personal experience, which is kind of outside the norm, but it's still going on, and then the technology that's not meant for an athletic audience? How did that eventually kind of get alchemized into something that is useful in sport?
What we started off doing was, first of all, I needed to satisfy my curiosity that, my reading wasn't totally out of the ordinary. And so we did a little pilot study where we just took all the athletes that we knew, and we just invited a load of people in and gave them sweat tests and started to build up our own mini data set. And then off the back of that, we started to play around with different advice off the back of it, because data is one thing, but what you want to do with the data is provide something actionable that's impactful for athletes. So we were like, okay, can we take a data point? Can we then give athletes a change to their strategy and see if it has a positive impact? And we were doing that and starting to see that certainly with a proportion of the cohort that we tested, we could have a dramatic impact on improving performance or recovery or whatever the thing was. And then what really kicked it into high gear was then we started to get invited by professional sports teams. A couple of people, heard what we were doing, and one of the very early adopters of this was the England rugby team, which is a sort of basically a big deal in the UK. It's second. The England national rugby team would be second in profile to the England national soccer team, and they wanted to get their squad tested, and we tested a bunch of players there, and we got 3 or 4 guys on the high end, and then a lot in the middle, and some on the low end. But what we started to learn with the team sport environment is a team will want to assess their players to see if they can learn something and be impactful, even if it doesn't materially change the strategy of what they do with 90% of the players. If they can positively influence 4 or 5 key players who do turn out to be at the higher end, the squad benefit is massive, or the team benefit is massive. So then we started to dive into, okay, well, let's start consulting with more teams and doing this, because the testing is like a screening process, and that the results from that, plus any sort of symptomatic stuff that you can collect by talking to athletes, who gets cramps, who suffers in the heat, who perceives they've got problems around this, then you often end up screening and testing a lot of people and finding out that they don't have huge changes to make in what they're doing, but the few that you do, it's a game changer.
Right. And
so that's one of the reasons why I think what you've identified in the way we try to present what we do is that most people, if you come at this from if you come at any commercial idea from an entrepreneurial angle, you want to maximize the available audience for your product or something like that. And sometimes that gets bastardized into, we're going to sell this to absolutely everyone that we meet, and we'll find a way to make it sound like it's necessary for them. What we've always tried to do is try to say, look, there's probably a group of people at the high end for whom this is, like for me, without putting too fine a point on it, like a life-changing thing. Because if you're serious about your sport, and if this is T-boning your athletic career, this can change it. Like a great example of that is Ashton Eaton, the decathlete. He had a sweat test with our test center in Oregon because he was cramping up in the summer and having all these problems and he has high sweat and sodium losses. So for him, this was like career and game changing. This was a huge deal. But then for every one of those, you get a bunch of people for whom it might make a marginal difference. It might help their understanding. It might tweak what they're doing and be an incremental improvement. And then you accept there's a bunch of people for whom this information is interesting to know, but ultimately doesn't result in any meaningful change. And so that's how we try and, view the starting point for what we do is like, we got to identify, part of our job is to identify who this could be really, really useful for. and then pursue working with them, supplying them with products or whatever and advice, rather than just kind of trying to dish it out to everyone.
But before we dive too far into who these tests are appropriate for and what they're going to learn from them, let's like paint a scene of the mind a little bit for what your test specifically looks like. Because there's going to be a lot of listeners out there that's like, I don't know what you do. You collect the sweat off of their skin, like do you have them pee into a cup and somehow you figure it out that way? Because the technology that you're using, it's not, a lot of athletes wouldn't guess that this is how you could collect sweat. So describe the scene when you bring somebody in for sweat testing. And there's a video that's on the Precision Hydration website that I'll also link in the show notes that has some athletes that are getting tested. But for those of the people out there that are just listening, just describe what it looks like.
So the sweat test that we perform is actually done at rest, which is the thing that catches a lot of people out. Because you expect you're going to have to exercise to produce sweat. And that is the traditional way. So normally, if you want a sweat test, you go to a lab, you sit on a bike or you run on a treadmill, they collect sweat in absorbent patches from different sites on the body, squeeze them out or centrifuge them out, run them through whatever analyzer they're using to identify composition, and you get a result. The test that we do uses a process called pilocarpine iontophoresis, which is basically a stimulation of the sweat glands in your arm. So we put a pair of electrodes on your arm for 5 minutes. We put a current through them, and that current puts a chemical into the skin, and that chemical is an analog for acetylcholine, which is what causes your sweat glands to produce sweat. And then you start sweating in an area which is about the size of a quarter on your arm, quite vigorously, and we collect that sweat into a little sealed container tube. So you sit there, we induce some sweating, we collect that sweat, and then it gets run through a desktop analyzer. So end to end, the process takes between 10 and 25 minutes, depending on your sweat rate. And we can then get a good idea of what your sodium concentration looks like, because that's the key thing that we're interested in.
And when you get that sodium concentration, it's obviously just from the site that you've collected it on. When they do sweat sodium testing using absorbent patches, I know sometimes they like to run it through an algorithm depending upon where it's collected, because different areas of the body can have different sweat sodium concentrations. Are you also going to that length, or are you just taking, this is where it is on the arm, and here's how we're like translating it into a hydration solution? Yeah,
it's a good question. They do use regression equations for different body parts. The forearm and the calf tend to be the closest off the bat to global whole body sweat composition. We run a small corrective equation on our samples when we put them through, but it's our own. That's based on our own algorithm, because when we've looked at the other algorithms, they were published a few years ago. They've been challenged recently because sweat rate changes the composition of sweat. And also what we've tried to increasingly do is take the focus away from the exact number into actually saying, well, the forearm is a good representation of total body sodium loss. It may not be exact, but based on all of our data, we know from that number whether the reading is low, medium, high, or very high. And what we're doing, everything that follows, is based on categorizing you like that. So in that regard, we're trying to work out if this was a t-shirt, we're trying to just figure out if you're a small, medium, large, or extra large, because that's the resolution that is helpful to an athlete. Because when to give my example, which as you've pointed out is a relatively extreme one, I was wearing a small when I needed a double XL. And so if you like need a medium but you've got a large, not so much of a problem. But what we're trying to do is get you in the right bucket, get you in the right zone.
That's a smart analogy. So we already went through one caveat, right? Which are the sites. Yeah. And before we kind of skip to like the end result too much, where you're putting people in these small, medium, large, extra large, or double extra large in your case categories, there's also another caveat that we kind of glossed over that I want to explore just a little bit more, and that is the rate of sweating affects the sweat sodium concentration as well. Yeah. So you guys, once again, to paint the picture, you're collecting sweat at rest. You're running it through an analyzer, which gives you a sweat sodium concentration.
Yeah.
You're then, I'm gonna, somebody in your company is gonna yell at me for using this phrasing, but I'm gonna use it anyway. You guys are fudging that number to a certain extent for whole body sodium sweat, and potentially the rate, because the rate changes the amount of sweat, or am I understanding
not
that
so
different?
much, because the basic principle with sweat rate and sweat sodium composition is that if you take a sweat sample from a certain part of the body, whatever part of the body, at a low sweat rate, you will probably get a slightly lower sweat sodium reading than if you take a sample from the same site with a very high sweat rate. So there are papers that show that with an increase in sweat rate, you get an increase in sodium loss, because per unit of volume. So it's not that net losses go up because you're sweating more or sweating faster, but also the concentration goes up. And the theory is that that's to do with the time of reabsorption in the sweat gland. So the sweat gland doesn't have as much capacity to reabsorb as fast. That's definitely a thing. But for me, when you get, and for research purposes, you've got to get into the weeds of that sort of stuff. But on a practical level, when we test athletes, when we do it our way with a electrical chemical stimulation of the sweat glands, we get a pretty high sweat rate. It's based on all of the testing I've done in exercise and iontophoresis testing. When we time the time it takes to fill one of these collectors, it's often quite similar from iontophoresis stimulation to what it is when you're in a heat chamber exercising really quite hard. So the sweat rate is pretty high. So we're tending to predict, I think, a relatively high rate of loss for that person. And to be clear as well, I think the magnitude of difference between what might be considered high and low, like if I sweat slowly and we collect the sweat, the composition might drop a few percentage points, but it's not going to drop to low. That's why I sort of always say to people that stuff is in the noise. It's like, it's a thing, but it's statistically significant, but maybe not clinically significant.
Okay. So the take-home message for the listeners here is that you feel that your at-rest procedure for collecting sweat sodium concentration is analogous to what you would see in the field underneath real conditions. I think that's what I'm trying to relay here, because they're all, I appreciate the way that you mentioned the research caveats. There are all of these research caveats that if you talk to the sweat experts who study this clinically, they'll say, well, this is slightly different under this condition and that's slightly different under that condition. You're kind of trying to find the best non-invasive way to do this and put people into these big is a relative word here. Put people in these medium, large, extra large, whatever types of categories from a practical perspective.
Yeah, 100%. Because I came at this wasn't any great, eureka insight. This was just the fact that I came at this from a purely practical angle. It was just that you need to know as an athlete, I believe, if you're doing long, hot endurance events, it's very useful at least to know whether you sweat a low, medium, high or very high amount of sodium in your sweat. Whether you then want to drill into like how many milligrams per litre and how many litres or milliliters of sweat and that kind of thing. There's a level of detail that is just unnecessary to make a practical difference. It's like saying, I'm going to, mark out this football field and I'm going to measure it. I'm measuring this by pacing it out in, a few strides and yards, and I'll probably, make a reasonable sized football field. The researchers that we often, work with or come up against, they've got a millimeter rule, and they're going along and theirs will be way more perfect, but will it allow for like a better game of football? I would question that in practical sense. I think both of those things have, and I'm not dismissing that work. It's important, but it often muddies the waters for athletes because it confuses athletes into how important is this stuff.
Yep, I'm with you there. Okay, so let's get into the t-shirt sizes, to use your analogy. The small, medium, large, extra large, double extra large, because you now have this sweat sodium concentration from an athlete, and you have solutions, products to fit that. Why don't you go run through like the range of what those are and why you picked kind of the levels of sodium that you picked in each one of those products? Because it's not like you're throwing a dart at the dartboard, right? You just don't make this stuff up. There's a reason why.
Sure.
There's a reason why they're formulated the way that they are. And just to give a little bit of a rant, you can probably appreciate this as well. It irritates me to no end when I see athletes like deliberately over concentrating or under concentrating the beverages that they're trying to consume, especially during ultramarathon. It's like, that's formulated a specific way intentionally.
Yeah.
like it's, but anyway, so what are the categories? What are the t-shirt sizes?
We looked at this and we decided that there's a reason why most sports drinks are formulated in that kind of zone that you mentioned, and we'll call it the sort of like roughly 500 milligrams per litre zone. And that's because that's a reasonable level of sodium replacement for people doing, shorter activities and also it's compatible with like a good tasting product, which is a really important factor for a lot of people who make sports drinks. Well, for everyone who makes sports drinks, because you've got to make it appealing. And also there's this whole thing where if you're selling sports products into retail and that kind of thing, you've got to be a bit careful about sodium levels in there, because the general messaging to the public is, less sodium. So if you've got to start sticking, no one's going to buy a product in there which is high sodium. That's not what people are looking for on the day-to-day shelves. Right. So we looked at it, but we thought, right, if at the lower end we're looking at 500 or so milligrams as kind of a standard one, then we felt that we needed a product in that zone to cater for an alternative, just one of our alternatives for people that have normal or low sweat sodium losses. The 1,000 milligram product, which is our sort of mid to high or medium high product, was designed to then cater for this uncatered market, which was the people who have higher sweat sodium losses and people who are doing longer activities. So the people for whom the standard sports drink is a little bit undergunned for them. And then the 1,500, we wanted to go relatively as high as we could go without causing something which tasted awful and upsets people's stomachs, and gave people like me who have really high losses or doing really hot sweaty activities over long periods, the highest sort of comfortably universally tolerable level of sodium. And so we experimented around that and slightly above that, and settled on those kind of three as nice round numbers, a nice kind of understandable system. So we called the products 500, 1,000, 1,500, and then we thought about going higher to do because I know some of the other companies have done sort of specific prehydration products which are really strong, like 3,600 milligrams per litre and that. And I played around with those a lot because I thought they would be really good for me, but I found that the trade-off of going significantly above 1,500 milligrams a litre was a high risk of stomach upset, GI upset, diarrhea, those kind of things. And we felt that we would stop there, because there are a couple of papers that have shown, for instance, those products are designed for preloading before activity, but there's some studies that have been shown that actually 1,500 milligrams a litre is a pretty good preload, with the caveat that it's also that level at which almost everyone can tolerate it without significant GI distress. So that was where we landed, and then it was a bit of test and adjustment of formulation, like what kind of compounds do we use to make them taste better. So we settled on sodium carbonate, sodium citrate, that kind of stuff, rather than lots of sodium chloride, because you put 1,500 milligrams of sodium via sodium chloride in a drink and it tastes like seawater. So you have a bit of a problem. Okay,
so you're still screwed though, right? Because you've got 2,000 milligrams per liter coming out of your sweat, and you make a product for 1,500 milligrams per liter. So do you, personally, I'm just trying to create a personal anecdote here, do you make up for that with tablets or other sports nutrition products when you're going out there?
Well, I think the interesting thing is, for anything other than really long and higher intensity activities, like for like replacement isn't usually the aim, or shouldn't be the aim. So for me, 1,500 milligrams per litre is adequate to replace the lion's share of what I'm losing and therefore maintain performance. So what you also tend to acknowledge as well is that people don't use these products in a vacuum. They'll use them with gels that have a bit of sodium in. In an ultra marathon, you'll probably be eating real foods which contain some sodium and stuff as well. So I think that's the other danger of going really high on sodium in drinks alone, is that you fail to adequately compensate for all the other sources of sodium that are coming into your mix in terms of nutrition. Yeah. But we do have one or two athletes. We had one very memorable guy who had sweat sodium losses of nearly 3,000 milligrams a litre, and we had him using the 1,500 with salt capsules as well, sweat salt capsules, and taking probably what was closer to 2,000 to 2,500 with every litre, and that got him round out Ironman Florida, when the previous 3 attempts had seen him in the medical tent or in the hospital every time.
Yeah. The like for like replacement has been a little bit of a fascination of mine recently. I mean, I think you've heard the podcast that I did with Stavros Kavaros.
Yes.
And there's another one that it'll be out by the time this podcast is released, but it's not out at the time that we're recording, that I did with Alan McCubbin out of Australia. And he and we discussed this concept as well of, okay, if you're losing 1,000 milligrams per liter, 1,000 milligrams per hour, however you want to define the rate, should you actually replace that much, a like for like type of replacement? And the consensus was like, we don't know. We don't know if you need to replace 100% of that or 80% of that, or there's some people that'll say you don't really need to replace any of it because you have enough body reserves. But I think in ultramarathon, which is going to be our audience, you'd be well served to replace the vast majority.
Agreed. Yeah, I would say that's a sensible aim, and that's why having a handle on the numbers and just sort of trying to figure that out. The great thing is when I work with, and I get to work nowadays with a lot of really elite athletes who are doing very well, and the first thing we do with those people is, rather than try and reinvent the wheel with their nutrition and hydration strategy, is analyze and break down exactly what they're doing and the outcomes it's having. And you often find that they've trial and errored their way to figuring these things out, and that what they use is a combination of hard-won experience. They might know their numbers a little bit, but they certainly can tell you what they take, and you can work out what's in it. And then when you compare that to what their measured losses are, they use a combination of that prior planning, but also a lot of testing and adjusting on the fly. It's they'll be able to tell you, when I feel X, Y, or Z, when my muscles start to feel tight or I start to feel twitchy, then I know I'm low on sodium or high on fluid, and I change the ratio. I take some extra salt, or when salt tastes good, I'm taking that, versus when plain water tastes good, and I'm because we've all had those feelings, when you drink an electrolyte drink and it tastes like garbage, because actually what you're craving is good old plain water, because probably what's happening there is you're becoming hypernatremic because you've lost a lot of fluid and maybe taken in a bit too much salt. So I think that for me, I do get asked this quite a lot, and it is hard to generalize, but if people say, how much should I aim to replace, I would say, if you want a ballpark to shoot in, between 50 and 75% of losses throughout the duration of an event is often good. Much below that or much above that, you may stray into problems. But so if people want an idea of where to start looking, I think you've got to replace more than half, but not as much as 100%.
Yeah, a little bit of it is duration dependent too. If you're going out for a 2-hour marathon, you could be at 50% or maybe even less. But if you're talking about, the Badwater ultramarathon is going to happen in the next few weeks here, they're exposed to 120 degree temperatures for, 20 hours of the race or something like that, 10 hours of the race. You could make the case that you need to err on the upper end of that percentage versus the lower end of that percentage, simply because of the duration and the total rate. But I think the point that the listeners can kind of take away from this is to get in the ballpark first versus trying to trying to split the hair too finely on, well, I'm a 627.5 milligrams per liter person, and this person is a 613 milligram per liter person. That those are the same people at that
exactly.
stage.
And I think what's really important to mention at this point is the interplay between, we talked about sweat rate and sodium, but what we try to do in our algorithms and in the way that we take the data is you need to take into consideration someone's general sweat rate. And sweat rate's obviously very variable between individuals, but also within an individual in different environments, and their sweat sodium concentration. So we might advise someone with a very high sweat sodium concentration who has a very low sweat rate to take a smaller amount of a weaker product than someone who's got an average sweat sodium concentration but an incredibly high sweat rate, because you're ultimately what you're trying to sort of work out with people is net losses over the duration of time or whatever. It's not always as simple as or concentration replacement per the concentration of your sweat. Because the third factor that comes into play is absorption rates and absorption capacity. Because if you're like, for me, if I can sweat 2.5 liters per hour quite comfortably, but I can probably not absorb much more than 1 to 1.2 liters per hour. So sometimes I need to up the sodium content a little bit more aggressively in order to retain as much of that fluid as possible and kind of make it work harder, because you can't keep going north with the fluid.
Right. I want to get into a little bit of this preloading strategy that you mentioned, but before we do that, you mentioned that there are all of these different ways that sweat sodium rate can change within an individual. And one of them is just through normal heat acclimation. Summer's coming around. We just off air, we were talking about how, nice the weather there is in the UK, and people are flocking to the beaches and things like that. Is that something that when you've been working with an individual athlete on their hydration plan and they go through a heat acclimation protocol, do you see the need to change their hydration plan like after going through that protocol, either because they're sweating more or their sweat sodium concentration has changed so much that you need to tweak it out a little bit?
I've done quite a bit of that testing, because we became interested in it because the literature suggests that you see a dilution of sweat with heat acclimation. But a lot of those studies, when you read them, were performed on military service personnel or less, people who weren't well-trained athletes, and they were reporting up to 25-30% reductions in sweat sodium concentration. Sometimes that was accompanied with a moderation of sodium in the diet as well. And what we see with athletes, if you give athletes free rein on their diet, if you take them and train them even in relatively extreme conditions, I've never seen a particularly dramatic sweat sodium reduction in an individual. Not over a sort of like 2, 3, 4 week period. I can't speak for if you go and live somewhere different. Although what we have done is we tested a lot of NFL players in Green Bay with the Packers, and a couple of them got traded to Miami to the Dolphins, and we ended up sweat testing them there as well. And even after a year of being in those conditions and training in those conditions, we got very similar sweat sodium numbers. So one of my personal theories on that is that with athletes who complete a high level of training anyway, we're already partly acclimated and to the heat a lot of the time already from general training load. So I think the variation in sweat sodium as a particular metric with heat acclimatization has less room to move than it does with less well trained people. So I don't. If we measured it twice and saw a significant drop, then we would, then maybe there might be a case for making some adaptations. But we just did this with a couple of riders at the Sunweb Pro Cycling team because their nutritionist was interested in that very question, and they did a big heat training camp earlier this year in Australia. And they were convinced. They said to me, we're going to see, I want to see how much these sweat sodium levels drop. And I wrote them an email and I said, look, I think you'll be disappointed. I think you won't see much shift in these people, but let's see. And true to form, they saw 5-8% reduction in sweat sodium concentration, but when you work that out in terms of order of magnitude over a 5-hour ride or whatever, it's like negligible.
Yeah. What about diet? Back to Adam's anecdote where he was trying to manipulate your tests by drinking the copious amount of sodium from one test to the other within, I think the time frame was like 2 hours or something.
A couple of hours, yeah. I think so. At the extremes, you can see some level of manipulation of sweat sodium with extreme changes in diet. So the very old literature where people completely sodium depleted through very extreme conditions. They went into a house, locked themselves away, boiled their food, sweated. After a few days, they saw reductions in sweat sodium levels because they depleted their body so severely of sodium. But interestingly, what they saw initially is within a few hours of stopping sodium consumption, you see a complete reduction in sodium loss in urine, but sweat is laggy. It takes a few days to catch up, and that's only at the extremes. I think what we'd have found, we weren't able to do this, but what I said to Adam at the time was, if we tested your urine like 3 hours after you've drunk this incredibly strong sodium, we'd see like a massive dumping of sodium because your kidneys are going to control for dietary intake predominantly, but it's not going to have an effect downstream on your sweat, not until you get to the real ridiculous extremes. So for free living people who consume a reasonable amount of sodium, whether it's like even relatively high or relatively low, I don't think that has a meaningful effect on sweat sodium because the primary regulatory mechanism in the body is the kidneys.
Right. So is it a fair statement to say that in trained athletes that have been training for years, they have a high training load, they're not changing their training or anything like that, that genetics is the driving factor of their sweat sodium concentration? Yeah, we can move it a little bit over here if we manipulate things to the extreme variable. If they undergo a heat acclimation protocol, maybe it changes by 5 or 10% or something like that. Is the primary driving factor genetics?
That would be my assessment from all my personal experience plus what I've read. I think so, because there's been some interesting biopsy studies where they've looked at sweat gland function particularly in cystic fibrosis patients and people without CF, but people who have high salt loss in their sweat, and they see reductions in CFTR channels, which are the bits that are around the sweat gland that reabsorb sodium. So basically the assumption is that you have less functional and less availability for reabsorption of sodium at the sweat gland, and that leads to higher sweat sodium losses. And so the genetics takes care of the lion's share of intra-individual difference, and everything else is like tweaking.
So precision hydration. So for that, I'm not trying to put you out of business or anything, but with that, maybe precision hydration 2.0 is not a sweat test. It's just a genetics test like you can get anywhere now. You spit into a tube or swab your cheek and send it off, and you find whatever genetics is correlated with it, and there you go.
It could actually be. I think the interim step for us, which we are working on pretty heavily, is wearable tech. So like something that measures sweat in real time and actually gives more of an up-to-date reading, because that's going to answer a ton of questions about like because we don't know how someone's sweat sodium concentration changes like 5 hours into a 10-hour ultra or something. And I've done tests on people during events and during training sessions, like tested before, during, after, that kind of thing, and seen it's been relatively stable, but that doesn't mean we don't know enough yet. So that's the next phase.
I think that's fascinating because of just what I've seen play out in ultra marathons. It's just such a complicated thing to study because, how many research subjects can you get to run on a treadmill for 10 hours or something like that? Like, it just becomes limiting just from the logistics piece of it. Let's go back to the sodium loading piece. Because I originally, when the World Championships in Doha happened, and then the Olympics in Tokyo looked like, before they changed the venues for the race walk and for the marathon, those two venues were going to be hot. Doha was super hot. They got a lot of criticism for how hot it was. And originally the marathon and the race walking venues for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, now 2021 Olympics, which is just weird to say, was supposed to be hot as well before they changed the venue. And I think a lot of the NGBs and the sports scientists that work with the teams were kind of like gearing up for their like hydration and heat acclimation strategies and things like that. And it looked like there were going to be some novel strategies emerge. Yeah. And one of them was going to be menthol, which is, you just start chewing on Hall's cough drops or Fisherman's Friend or something like that. We're not going to talk about that, but I think it's neat. But the other two, in terms of sodium loading or hyperhydration pre-event, are using a high sodium concentration drink or glycerol. Yeah. And kind of where your wheelhouse is the high sodium concentration drink, and you're using the 1500 milligram version, 1500 milligrams per liter version of your product to do that. Our experience with that and using it kind of commercially at our camps, we've used Osmo's preload product, which is, I think it's 3.5 grams per liter.
Yeah, it is 3,600, I think.
So over double what that is. And personally, I've also used the Scratch Hyperhydrations, and I think we've used that at our camps a couple of times. But for the normal athletes that are going out there, they're training their butts off at these camps where they're doubling or tripling their volume, and normally it's a summer camp, so it's super hot. For over half of them, it kind of ends up being a game changer. Yeah, because they can just tolerate the heat a whole lot better. Now, we haven't run into the GI distress that you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to dig a little bit more into that. Like, is that something that you commonly find when you put people on these like hyperhydration solutions, that they just can't tolerate it for whatever reason?
Yeah, I've seen that more pre-race, because I think when you get into pre-race situation, people are more nervous. You've got all sorts of like weird mess up of your sympathetic parasympathetic system, and you've tapered your training down. You're already relatively well loaded on most things, or you should be. So it's different, because I've drunk a whole litre of like the really strong, there's some of those really strong products when I've come in from a super hot run, and it's like when your body needs that stuff, or when it's receptive to it, when you're physiologically primed that it's going to help, you can absorb it like that. Yeah. It's fantastic. So maybe in a heavy training load scenario, we've been cautious by going to 1500. Now, there are a lot of athletes that I work with, and I do it myself on occasion, is I'll mix that, because you talked about people like over mix or mixing things strong. I'll mix mine a little bit stronger based on personal experience for preload only. I don't tend to do it when I'm exercising, and honestly, it's one of the things which is it creates a bit of tension our end, because in the one hand we want to individualize, and we want to tell people if you need it a bit stronger, go a bit stronger, but we also want to make sure that people are conservative, because we'd rather that you kind of preloaded a little bit less effectively but definitely didn't have GI distress, because that can be horrifically bad and really spoil your race. So the theory behind those is all the same though, and essentially, obviously, any sodium, the extra sodium load pulls more fluid into your bloodstream, increases your plasma volume. And I think that if I was, working with athletes for Doha, I've been working with a couple for Tokyo, we're going to try a lot of times in training and small races and stuff, going as strong as you can go, but it's just a little bit individual.
Yeah, when we kind of first introduced that to athletes at our camps, a lot of the times we'll cut it in half. So it ends up being 1800 milligrams per liter or something like that. And part of that is just to like be a little bit conservative on the sodium dump that we're giving them, so they don't experience that GI distress. But a lot of it, to be honest with you, is just the taste. I mean, they're not the greatest tasting beverages out there. You do have to like, pinch your nose and chug them down like a little bit better cold. I don't have a problem with them because I just chug it all in a couple of seconds. But anyway, I found it interesting that you're using that you would also advocate for that 1500 milligram as a potential solution for the hyperhydration. And then we also have this experience where we're at times we've like cut those traditional hyperhydration beverages in half, which ends up being kind of the same concentration.
Yeah, as I say, I think that's the lowest concentration that seems to be reliably effective and kind of in the zone for being the highest that's universally tolerable. But definitely it's one of the few areas where we would encourage athletes to maybe play around a bit stronger. But that's always just a dangerous game to get in with athletes, because if you say a little more is a little better, you'll always find someone who do 5 times more.
Yep.
And,
Ultra runners are notorious for that. If 1 is good, 2 is better, and 10 is the best.
Exactly.
Like that's just, well, endurance athletes, I mean, you grew up Ironman stuff. They're pretty notorious for that as well. Okay, so what athletes are candidates to get this stuff done? Because there's a lot of people out there that are going to go, you know what, I drink this drink and it works for me, and, I don't have any issues and blah, blah, blah. But there are other athletes out there that either want to tinker with optimizing their hydration or optimizing their sodium intake, or have the experience like you have where for whatever reason they're at the edges of the bell curve and the most of the mass commercially available products just kind of aren't meeting their needs. How does an athlete kind of figure that out, like figure out the step that, hey, this is a viable test for me to get?
I think that the first obvious ones are people that feel they have very high sweat rates or experience severe problems in the heat, particularly, especially if they see visible salt marks or get cramps or have any of those symptoms, where if there's a big disconnect between your performance in cooler, more temperate conditions where you could feel like you can perform at the level of your fitness ability, and you feel that heat puts an unnatural dampener on your performance. So I'll give you an example of we work with a Pro Tour cyclist who has won classics and kind of Belgian races and big time stuff in the colder months, who has consistently massively underperformed in the summer in the heat. And when we tested him, his sweat sodium level was like 1700 milligrams per litre. Things started to come together, and for him it was the test he was looking for, even though he didn't know he was looking for it, because of that simple factor. He was like underperforming massively in the heat. So that's a big sign. Like I said, I mentioned cramping because although cramping is a whole nother controversial topic on its own, but there's no smoke without fire in my view there, and there's a significant correlation and a lot of anecdotal reports, of people who experience cramping along with electrolyte disturbance. So if you're kind of a chronic cramper, this could be a place to go looking. And I think if you just have a very, very high sweat rate, because although that doesn't necessarily indicate a high sweat sodium concentration, when we've worked with athletes that do really well in hot conditions routinely, quite often they're not always the ones with they're certainly not the ones with the heaviest sodium losses often, but they're also often not the ones with the highest sweat rates, because although you need a level of sweat rate for cooling, beyond a certain point that becomes a disadvantage. So if you're disadvantaged by your sweat rate, then it can be a useful part of an investigation. The other group of people for whom it's really useful, and we see a lot of these in the UK, is okay, I live in a cool climate and I'm paying a ton of money to go off and do a race in a hot climate, and I've not got an opportunity to go and do loads of acclimation camps and all this sort of stuff. It's like, well, we better kind of triage that. So the Marathon des Sables is a big one for us. We get a lot of people who are relatively, for whatever reason, relatively novice ultra runners who decide, hey, this looks like a nice week's holiday in the desert, and they go and do MDS, and we do a lot of sweat tests before them in the UK before they go, because we can sometimes flag people. It's like, actually, you're going to really have to pay attention to electrolytes here because you're on the heavy end of losses. So that's probably another group. And then the final group would be people who are serious and transitioning from short distance races to very long races. So if you've been like a marathon runner or a half marathon runner and you're jumping straight in there at the 100 miles or the 100k type thing, if you're not, it can potentially be helpful for those people because it helps shortcut the experience that they're going to build up through not going and failing in one of those because they didn't understand this. So
yeah, the length allows for less opportunity of error.
Yes, yeah, basically.
Yeah. When you have people, you've got this big data set now. You said 10,000 athletes. How are they generally stratified between your 500 milligram product, your 1,000 milligram product, and your 1,500 milligram product?
That would depend. I wouldn't be able to give you an honest breakdown of that data because what I've seen to date has been the data on the sweat sodium concentration, not the sweat sodium concentration plus the sweat rates. So that would influence the product recommendation.
Right.
What I can tell you though that is not particularly sensitive in terms of commercial information or anything is that the 1,000 milligram product and the 1,500 milligram product sell a lot more in our range than the 500 milligram one.
Okay.
Now there could be a ton of reasons for that, but I think that for most people, when we're recommending something off the bat, which we don't like to do, but with very little information, if we have to make a recommendation to someone, the 1,000 milligram product is a relatively good catch-all because it's a bit stronger than average, and if you're doing long and hot stuff, a little bit more electrolyte is probably less harmful than taking way less than you need, and so it's the 1,000 milligram strength is probably the biggest component, but that might also be because it's also slightly differentiated from the rest of the market because you've got a ton of choices. If you want a weak sports drink, you just go to 7-Eleven.
Yeah, and that's what I would guess because your 500 milligram product, as we've mentioned earlier, that's in the range of everything else. There's no product differentiation at that point. Yeah. There is at 1,000. Like I can't think of a commercial product that's out there that's. I mean, I guess Scratch Labs would be the closer to that. They're like 800 milligrams or 860 milligrams.
Yeah, about 700, I think. Yeah, Noon, and I think Noon is maybe about that as well. 700.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean that's where your product differentiation is in kind of in those upper ranges. So that that totally makes sense to me. And I'm, as a take-home message for the listeners, I'm completely on board with slightly overshooting what you think you need versus undershooting because your body has compensatory mechanisms to kick out excess. And in particular with a really long ultra marathon, the error of being hyponatremic is the thing that you want to avoid the most. So taking in too little sodium throughout the course of that big long ultra marathon that's the thing that you want to avoid the most.
Yeah. I'd agree with that, and I listened to your podcast with Stavros, where he talked about the Spartathon in Greece, and one of the most interesting things in that was that 10% of the starters turned up hyponatremic.
I know, right?
Because they'd overdrunk in the days leading up, and that's a classic one that we see, and that's where the education around the preloading and not neglecting sodium intake, and also just as importantly not overdoing fluid intake in the days prior. It harks back to something we did years ago when we did a little pilot study in our lab, and we told people they're going to come in for a heat chamber session. We're going to draw some blood and just turn up well hydrated. And like 50% of it was only 8 participants, but 50% of them were hyponatremic.
It's hilarious.
When they showed up, and then we rewrote the protocols because it's like, okay, if you tell people to turn up well hydrated, what they're going to do is turn up hyponatremic. Yeah,
it's hilarious how that happens time and time again in nutrition studies. It's the same thing with just general nutrition tracking. Like, when people go, they're going to like log what they eat for 3 days or whatever, they're going to underconsume calories compared to, nobody's watching them essentially. Okay, so we've got this situation now, right? People are listening to this podcast and they're like, okay, maybe I fit in one of these categories that Andy mentioned earlier. You have this test that it requires a pretty sophisticated piece of equipment to operate. And this thing, it's the size of a small suitcase.
Yeah.
Sits on a desktop. It's not like, they're sitting at every 7-Eleven or anything like that. How do athletes go about actually getting the test done if they think they need to get it done?
On our website, we've got a Find a Test Center page, which is kind of in the footer of the thing, and if people want to shortcut the process, the easiest thing to do is email us, which is hello@precisionhydration.com. Tell us where you're based and we can direct you to the nearest centre where there's a precision hydration sweat test. And we have a number. I think we have like 30 or so across the US now. We have them in Australia. We have lots in the UK, obviously, where we are. And we'll always endeavour to kind of hook you up with someone who can do a test. And if you can't do a full test, on our website is a link to an online test, which is like a questionnaire-based test, which is, not nowhere. Well, I wouldn't say nowhere near as good as a full test. It's better than doing nothing, and it's based on a lot of questions that we've developed and refined over the years that tend to point towards whether you're more likely to have a low, medium or high requirement for electrolytes, and then it will recommend some strategies, and that's free to do. People can just click the button and try that and do it in 2 minutes.
Have you guys taken any steps to like validate that questionnaire versus what people actually come up with in an actual sweat test?
Yeah, in one of the papers that we published a couple of years ago, we looked at the questions that we'd asked the athletes before they were tested, and we actually then compared, in that case, one particular question, how much salt do you think you lose in your sweat, low, medium, high, or very high amount, and we found that there was a strong correlation between. This was with professional athletes, it needs pointing out, but these professional athletes were able to, there was a good correlation between them saying they had a high or very high sweat sodium loss and us actually finding that in a measurement. So a questionnaire is never going to be perfect, and we wouldn't pretend that it is, but it's a good pointer in the right direction. And actually recently, one of the things that we've done, because we've all been, when we're recording this, we've all been, kind of at home and locked down or in various states of house arrest for a few months. We've been doing a lot of video calls with athletes, and that's a service that we're going to continue, and it's totally free. People can hit the website, email hello@precisionhydration.com or WhatsApp us through the website, and we can set up a free 15-20 minute video consult with you to kind of take your online test results and then talk you through it in a bit more detail and answer some specific questions.
The testing centers that you guys have set up, are those is that your equipment that you've just sent around and they're just sitting somewhere, or are they affiliates? Like how does that work?
Test centers generally tend to purchase the equipment from us along with training on how to use it, and they use our software to generate test reports, and then we work with them. So they're kind of like partners and trusted people that we've met and worked with over the years. So it's a combination of we have them in a lot of sports science clinics, and we have them with some medics. We have them with even in some bike fit places, and specialist running stores, that kind of thing. I'm surprised at that broad spread distribution of 30 locations around the US. That's a lot for a company you guys' size. Yeah, I think it's just it's just grown steadily. We've been at this for 10 years now, and we've just gotten around a bit, spoken to people, and people get interested in this, especially I think nowadays when the idea of customization of everything is the thing, isn't it? When I started riding bikes, however many years ago, you just set your bike up yourself, and some guy at the bike shop looked at you and was like, yeah, we'll do this, do that. Now it's all computerized, it's personalized, you have your right cleats, you have your right inner soles, everything is optimized and individualized, and I think people like this idea quite rightly that nutrition, hydration, that's the next thing to individualize.
So what's after that? We mentioned some of the genetic testing or potentially some of the wearables. Is that what eventually is going to come down the line? People are wearing a wearable and it's literally telling them you need to take product X over the course of the next hour or something like that. What's next?
I think it will go in that general direction. What I would hope is more realistic is that we'll have wearable type technology where athletes can go and simulate things or collect data in races, and then we can use kind of big data, so data on there, because we can measure a lot of stuff with athletes now in real time. So you can measure heart rate, you can measure speed, pace, elevation, or humidity, temperature. If we can measure sweat rate, sodium loss, performance, all of those things, we can run that in AI and that kind of thing to start to look at trends. And what can we I think that we'll start to see trends. One of the theories with the sweat composition thing you see is that as your plasma volume decreases and becomes more concentrated, electrolyte levels are effectively rising in your plasma, and is that reflected in your sweat sodium or sweat metabolites? So can you kind of detect dehydration a little bit earlier? And that's the type of thing that I think will realistically come about. I also think linking it with pacing, core body temperature, sensing, those kind of things are all becoming a lot closer to being accessible to athletes at all times. And so you will have a lot more data that will include sweat metrics coming through your watch, coming through your phone. And I think there will be companies where it's simply, you're sweating this, you need to drink Y, but what we want to do is be a bit more real world than that. And it might suggest that at times you need to drink certain things, but more realistically it's like, well, how does this, competing in an endurance event is a very complex interaction of lots of factors, and you want to get information from the body to the person, or if it's in a Tour de France, to the team car, to then allow tactical decisions, pacing decisions, and whatever else. So I'm quite excited about sort of getting involved in that as it transpires.
Yeah, the wearable area is going to be cool to see where it goes, because I almost kind of feel like there's going to be this line that eventually gets crossed where we're collecting things, not too many things, but too many things at too granular of a detail.
Yeah.
Right. That's and going back to you guys' solution to having a small, medium, and large fit for sodium, it's collecting that granular of information can sometimes just be overkill, but who knows if we get to that stage or not.
And I think that's part of the clever bit is going to be, maybe you're collecting the data in a really granular way, but how do you present that to the athlete?
Exactly. 100%.
And how do you present it to the coach? And I would see, maybe certainly in the early iterations, I would see it more useful in planning and debriefing than in on the fly changes.
Yeah, 100%. All right, we're going to leave it there. See what the future holds. Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, somebody will have a wearable that collects sweat sodium concentration, and you guys will be like the first adopters and be able to integrate it into your business. Before we let you go, where can people find more about you and about Precision Hydration and what you guys do?
precisionhydration.com is definitely the best place, and feel free to email us, hello@precisionhydration.com, and we love talking to athletes, genuinely. So get in touch. And we're a small team, there's 10 of us in PH, so you talk to a real human, and that's the best place to find us.
Awesome. Appreciate your time, Andy. Appreciate your knowledge, and keep doing what you do in the space. I mentioned from the onset of this podcast, and I also mentioned in the intro that I appreciate the solution that you're bringing to this problem, because it balances the correct amount of scientific vigor that you can put into the problem with the practicality of athletes actually exercising and working out and racing in the field. And whenever I can encounter practitioners and sports scientists and coaches that can blend those two, I'm always very appreciative of it. And I think you guys do that really well.
No, thank you. And we really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat to you on this, because you have a great podcast that we're all listening to in the office now. And
awesome,
it's cool to be on it. It's
awesome.
very cool.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And there we have it, folks. That was chock full of a lot of good information. I definitely learned a lot throughout the course of that conversation with Andy. Andy, appreciate you a ton. We will definitely connect once you can fly back over to the US, and we can get some running in along the way. Appreciate all the listeners out there. Thank you for tuning into this podcast. If you are so inclined, give this podcast a like or a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can share it with your friends. The community that we have built here with the KoopCast is a really good one. I have been quite impressed and very humbled with the feedback that I have received, both personally and through social media outlets. So thank you all for listening. Appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you, and we will see you out on the trails.